What's up, you all? About to go live on Instagram. All right. Wait for some people to come in and give it a second. And give it a second. This is yet another Tales from the Blatrix. And I realize that any identity that is of this world, what's up, Edna? Any identity that is of this world ultimately leads in human enslavement, which means that every identity that is attached to this world has a system of control attached to it. Every single one of them. You'll see later on there will be a difference between human beings and transhumans and AI, and you'll see the difference then. Most folks can't conceptualize it now, but you'll see it in the future. Yeah, it's like Tales from the Crib. Yeah, exactly. Let me see if I can get this mic Oh, can you all hear me now? Sorry about this, you all on Instagram. I'm sorry. Uh, Technical difficulties. I'm sorry. Y'all should be able to hear me now. Y'all be able to hear me now. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Just give me a thumbs up. No, it's not YouTube. It's me. It's this mic. I had the wrong thing plugged in at first. If you all can hear me, just give me a thumbs up so I can get started. You all can hear me? Okay, now. Okay, sorry about that, you all. So I was talking about identity, and I think the problem is eventually is, the world will come down to those that identify as, God's people and those that identify with the world. Like I said before, there will be a whole transhumanism movement, an AI movement. Everybody will be a human movement, an altered DNA movement. Everybody's going to be jockeying for their identification in this world, but it will all be a part of ultimately Satan's system. So I'm gonna let folks come in, Brandon. I was just talking to YouTube. I'm talking to YouTube. But I'm gonna let folks come in on Instagram real quick, give folks a chance to come on, and then I'm gonna get started on this. But it's really about an identification, and that's what people struggle with because everybody wants to belong to something and identify with something. Everybody wants to identify with something. How can I view this? Yeah, there we go. So let me get to my share screen. There we go. Let me get to this. Just give me 1 second. Instagram, y'all should be in now. So with most of our understanding of slavery, colonialism, racism has already been programmed in us. So before we ever find anything on our own, they've already given us information. As I've said before, if someone gives you information, they're already trying to deceive you. Information is something that has to be earned. Information is something that has to be learned. So I want to first talk about Harriet Tubman real quick in the beginning. And then I want to go back and talk about now, you all can't see it, but basically on my screen on YouTube, on Instagram, I have Julia Roberts, and Hollywood wanted Julia Roberts to play Harriet Tubman. Now, why do you think Hollywood would want Julia Roberts to play Harriet Tubman? Now, the low-hanging fruit is to say that it's racism. The low-hanging fruit is to say that it's racism. But we're going to be a little more advanced today, and we're going to ask, why would Hollywood put Julia Roberts as an option to play Harriet Tubman? Just think. Think about playing a character and think about who's allowed to cross over the racial lines with characters. This is not a white or black thing. The reason why Julia Roberts can play Harriet Tubman, and I'm trying to get a better picture for you all. The reason why Julia Roberts can play Harriet Tubman is because Harriet Tubman is a fictional character. The only way Hollywood would say we want a white woman to play a black woman is if the character wasn't real. If you look at Cinderella, the Cinderella story, look how many times Cinderella has been remade, and look how many times they've used different races or ethnicities to play the characters in Cinderella. Cinderella has been all types of races and characters because she's a fictional character. If you notice, when they use fictional characters, they would take the idea of Julia Roberts being Harriet Tubman because they know it's not a real character. Just put your thinking caps on. Just put your thinking caps on. Now, they have Charlton Heston. Look at Moses. Everybody that's played Moses has been white. Ironically, Harriet Tubman was going to be played by a white person, right? Ironically, how many times has God been portrayed as black in Hollywood? Think about it now. Just think about how they mixing and crossing all of these characters. But think about why they're doing it. Why are they doing this? Why would they have Julia Roberts play? Why would they have Julia Roberts play Harriet Tubman? Why would they have Morgan Freeman play God? So you got to understand there's a reason, there's a method to the madness when it comes to Hollywood. And what Hollywood does is Hollywood strategically puts the truth in front of your face, right? Put it in front of your face, but you got to pay attention to the details. It's the details. Now I'm going to ask you all a question before I jump back into these slave ships or the first slave. But Harriet Tubman was, let me go to her time period. I got my notes here. I'm prepared. Now, I know many of you all would be like, Harriet Tubman was real. Now, listen, I'm not saying that Harriet Tubman wasn't real. I'm saying what they said she did, she didn't do. It's no way. You got to think about the time period. Harriet Tubman was born in 1822 and she died in 1913. I'm going to just ask you all a simple question. What man in the 1800s would risk his life following a woman? I'm asking again. What man in the 1800s would risk his life following a woman? They told us that the slave, the male slave would watch his wife get raped repeatedly and not do nothing. That same male slave would follow Harriet Tubman into certain danger. Does that make sense to you? Is that realistic for a man to be on a plantation and watch his wife get raped, but then turn around and follow Harriet Tubman to freedom? Does that even make sense? If a man was brave enough to follow a woman, then he would be brave enough to knock his master upside the head or chop his head off for raping his wife.
it doesn't make any sense. I'm dropping that nugget for you all right now, but now I'm going to go back to slavery in the U.S. Now, I probably lost some of you all. I probably lost some of you all already, but we're going to keep going. I said I probably lost some of you all already, but we're going to keep going. So the fascinating story of Anthony Johnson. Now I got my notes today, and we're going to talk about two people. We're going to talk about Anthony Johnson, and we're going to talk about John Punch. Anthony Johnson and John Punch. Now, let's go to Anthony Johnson first. Let's go to him first. Let's go to him first. Let's go to him first. And I got my notes, but I want to read this to you all. Okay, so Anthony Johnson was a Black Angolan known for achieving wealth in the early 17th century colony of Virginia. So in the early 17th century, he achieved wealth, so we can go ahead and shatter the notion of slavery. Anthony Johnson was a Black Angolan known for achieving wealth in the early 17th century colony of Virginia. So we can go ahead and shatter the notion of slavery. He was one of the first African Americans whose right to own property was recognized by Virginia courts. Now, what you all got to understand something is this. If they're telling us that we were 3/5 of a human being, we were treated as animals, we were slaughtered, we had no rights, then why would they have to go to the courts? It doesn't make any sense. Why is all this stuff done through the courts? It doesn't make any sense. Why go through all of this if the people you're dealing with don't have any rights? When you all go to court over animals, you all go to court over animals to see who's going to own the animal, see who has rights to the animal. But the animal can't take the witness stand. So if you all are fighting over a dog, the dog can't get on the witness stand and say, I want to go with that owner, I want to go with that master. So how are we going through all this stuff for a group of people that have no rights? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So, hailed as an indentured servant in 1621, he earned his freedom after several years and was granted land by the colony. So you mean to tell me these racist white folks gave him some land? Let me read this right. Anthony Johnson was a Black Angolan known for achieving wealth in the early 17th century of colony Virginia. He was one of the first African Americans whose right to own property was recognized by Virginia courts. Hailed as an indentured servant in 1621, he earned his freedom after several years and was granted land by the colony. So not only did they give him, give him out of his indentured servitude, but they also granted him some land. Now, these racist white people, so racist, lynching us, beating us, raping us, buck breaking us, tearing us apart. We see in the 1600s, they giving us land. I know what y'all say. Y'all saying Blanche. That's not true. White people was terrorizing us. They were slaughtering us. They were destroying us. Okay. He later became a tobacco farmer in Maryland. He attained great wealth after completing his term as an indentured servant and has been referred to as the Black patriarch of the first community of Negro property owners in America. So you mean to tell me in the 1600s, this man started a community filled with his people that own property? Now, somebody said he probably looked white, but he really didn't. I'm gonna put his picture up right here because he really don't look. It's clear what he is. Let me get to it though, because y'all think it's a game. Because y'all think it's a game. Anyway, now Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to a white planter named Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm. So he wasn't picking cotton. They don't tell you all about tobacco farms. They don't tell you all how tobacco farms where people worked, regardless of color. We're talking about industries. They want you to believe that all white people were on the porch sipping lemonade, watching you all work out in the fields. It's called industry. The same way people work in industries today, they did back then. What they're trying to do to you all is they're trying to romanticize and fantasize a history to make you all feel inferior. Somebody said it wasn't just cotton. Now, I know folks on these lives on Instagram and they're getting upset because if you don't have this to hold on to, then what do you have? This kind of information right here completely destroys the Democratic Party. It just shatters it completely. They have no, the Democratic Party only has leverage. And when I say Democratic Party, I'm not telling you all that Republicans are great and they're perfect. I'm telling you all that one party in particular one party relies heavily on this slave narrative. They don't rely on you all being empowered. It's just not what it is. They don't. Now, when Johnson was released from servitude, not slavery, he was legally recognized as a free Negro. He became a successful farmer. In 1651, he owned 250 acres. In 1651, he owned 250 acres. If you own that much land now, you'd probably be considered wealthy. If you own 250 acres right now, you will be considered a wealthy person. He owned 250 acres back in 1651. Back when they was lynching, hanging, 1651, it was slavery going on. So that means, according to this, that means this man had a community full of people that looked like him owning property, owning land, and then next over was a plantation, was the people that looked just like him working. Now I'm gonna ask you all a question: was slavery a choice? If there were slaves on a plantation and across the way there were some folks that looked just like them that were free and owned their own property, was slavery a choice? What separated this man from the people over there across the way picking cotton, looking over at him, walking around free? Okay. John Kaser a black indentured servant whose contract Johnson appeared to have bought in the early 1640s. So when it comes to indentured servitude isn't by force. Indentured servitude is not by force. You have to agree to that because you're usually paying off a debt. Turn to your neighbor and say, the Bible says be the lender and not the borrower. Turn to your other neighbor and says, the Bible says be a lender and not a borrower. Be the head and not the tail. This is why. Because when you owe a debt, back then, you had to work it off. See, society wasn't soft back then like it is now. Now you can run your credit up. All kind of scams and loans and all that stuff. Now you can do all kind of white collar crimes. Back then, if you owed a debt, they wanted it with your blood, sweat, and your tears. So, where was that? John Kaser, a black indentured servant whose contract Johnson appeared to have bought in the early 1640s, approached Captain Goldsmith claiming his indentured had expired 7 years earlier and that he was being held illegally by Johnson. A neighbor, Robert Parker, intervened and persuaded Johnson to free Kaser. Parker offered Kaser work and he signed a term of indentured to the planter again. Now, this man done went from being somebody's indentured servant to signing up with somebody else. The same thing folks do today. They sign a record deal that's horrible. They see everybody sign a record deal, don't get no money. And then they go and sign a record deal. We're talking about human beings and their character. Ain't nobody forcing nobody to be no slave. You couldn't force someone to be a slave because they would choose death. If they implemented slavery right now, do you think these white rednecks and hillbillies gonna be slaves? You crazy. They're not gonna do it. A lot of us will do it. A lot of us will talk all that rah-rah stuff, but I saw us line up for Joe Biden and that jab. The two J's. Y'all talking about J&J Johnson and Johnson. Nah, Joe and that jab. That's the new two J's. We lined up in droves by the millions for the J&J, the Joe and the jab. So this man went from indentured servitude with Anthony Johnson to now he's an indentured servant to somebody else. To Robert Parker. Johnson sued Parker in Northampton Court in 1654 for the return of Kaser. The court initially found in favor of Parker, but Johnson appealed. In 1655, the court reversed the ruling, finding that Anthony Johnson still owned John Kaser, and the court ordered that he be returned with the court dues paid by Robert Parker. This was the first instance of a judicial determination in the 13 colonies holding that a person who had committed no crime could be held in servitude for life. For life. For life. So this man, now I can tell by the way this man did this, he wasn't too bright. Because there's no way this man was really free of his debt for him to go and get debt again. Think about what he did. He was an indentured servant to Anthony Johnson. Then he left and became an indentured servant to Robert Parker. That lets me know his debt wasn't paid up, because there's no way you go from your debt being paid up to then going and getting it. It doesn't make any sense. What he tried to do was what folks always try to do. They got a contract over here, like Meg Thee Stallion. Remember, Meg Thee Stallion was signed to that baseball player's label, but she wanted to go sign with Roc Nation. It's the same thing. You already got a contract with somebody else, but you want to go over here and be with these people because you probably like Robert Parker better. We don't know. He probably liked Robert Parker. So Robert Parker said, look, I'll take on the debt. That's why Anthony Johnson had to go to court to fight over Kaser. To fight over John Kaser. But in the midst of all of this, we got to realize it's in the 1600s. So according to the records, the first slave arrived here at 1619. So that means during the beginning of slavery, where it's in full swing, where they're telling you we're getting hunted down, lynched, beat, stabbed, raped, all this, they in court, they're in court fighting over an indentured servant. And everybody is from our community. Make it make sense to me. Make it make sense to me. Now, this was a landmark case, and my cousin just said it. She said, and when he won the case, the light bulb came on for the white folks, and they realized they can utilize humans for gain. This was a landmark case because this case, now remember you all, court cases set precedents. Remember what I'm telling you all, court cases set precedents. So in this court case, this pretty much legally said you can own another person as long as what? As long as they're indentured servant and they have not honored their end of the agreement. The problem is once that contract is breached, which Kaser breached the contract with Anthony Johnson, now you got to be an indentured servant for life. Now you got to be an indentured servant. So the punishment for not working off your debt is to be a servant for life. Think about someone that goes to prison and you keep committing crimes and going back to prison. Eventually, they're going to do what? Keep you there for the rest of your life. It's the same thing. This is all about debts being paid. It's all about what's being owed. They're making it racial. I'm telling you it's not racial because everybody in the situation right here looks like us. So it can't be about race. Though Kaser was the first person who was declared a slave in a civil case, there were both black and white indentured servants sentenced to lifetime servitude before him. Read it again. Now, the white liberals will never tell you this because their being white slaves shatters the entire notion. But mark my words, they're going to get on TV one day and they're going to tell you all that everybody was a slave. And they're going to say that everybody had a part in slavery. So they're going to say there's no more racism. If everybody took part in slavery, if everybody was a slave, then that means there's no racism because everybody played a part in the oppression of everybody else. So they're going to get on TV one day. They're going to tell you all this stuff. And when they tell you all this stuff, just know they're telling you all this because you won't have any rights anymore. It's going to be about the transgenders, the transhumans, the transformers, the trans AI. All of them going to have the rights. Not y'all. They going to have the rights. I'm just telling you all. This whole black thing was a setup from the beginning. They wanted to set you all up from the jump. And they want you tied to the slave thing because if you think you're a slave, because think about it. If they start your history as slavery, then that means you're a slave. That means you're a slave. I'm sorry. They don't tell you that you all are kings and queens. They don't call y'all kings and queens. They don't say y'all was great. These folks get on TV and say y'all history started with slavery. Nothing else. They don't mention nothing pre-slavery. Though Kaser was the first person who was declared a slave in a civil case, there were both black and white indentured servants sentenced to a lifetime servitude before him. Many historians describe indentured servant John Punch as the first documented slave, or a slave for life in America, a punishment for escaping his captors in the 1640s. Punch was required to serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. The Punch case was signified because it established the disparity between his sentence as a Negro and that of the two European indentured servants who escaped with him. One described as a Dutch and one described as a Scotsman. So John Punch, let's pivot to John Punch real quick. So John Punch So John Punch was an indentured servant, and he was working with a Dutch and a Scotsman. Now, John Punch was working with a Dutch and a Scotsman. So you got John Punch, you got a Dutchman, and you got a Scotsman, and they all indentured servants. They both working and slaving together. They decide to escape. Now, what makes this case interesting is that when they caught the two white servants, their sentence was, some extra time, some extra years as an indentured servant. But John Punch's punishment was life. Now, we see two cases where one ran away and one got under someone else's indentured servant to be an indentured servant, and both of them got life as an indentured servant. But I want to note that indentured servant isn't the same as a slave. An indentured servant isn't the same as a slave. And clearly it's not, because we can see when dealing with the indentured servant, you got to go through the courts. I said, dealing with an indentured servant, you got to go through the courts. Now, what's interesting about, well, hold on, let me say this real quick. So the case of lawsuit demonstrates the culture and mentality of planters in the mid-17th century. Individuals made assumptions about the society of Northampton County and their place in it. According to historians T.H. Breen and Stephen Ines, Kaiser believed he could form a stronger relationship with his patron, Robert Parker, than Anthony Johnson had formed over the years with his patrons. Kaiser considered the dispute to be a matter of patron-client relationship, and this wrongful assumption resulted in his losing his case in court and having a ruling against him. Johnson knew that the local justices shared his basic belief in the sanctity of property. The judge sided with Johnson, although in the future legal issues, race played a larger role. So the Kaiser lawsuit was an example of how difficult it was for Africans who were indentured servants to prevent being reduced to slavery. Most Africans could not read and had almost no knowledge of the English language. Planters found it easy to force them into slavery by refusing to acknowledge the completion of their indentured contracts. This is what happened in Johnson versus Parker. Although two white planters confirmed that Kaiser had completed his indentured contract with Johnson, the court still ruled in Johnson's favor. So what messed Kaiser up was this. Kaiser was supposed to go to court. Kaiser was supposed to go to court and handle this legally. He wasn't supposed to breach his contract. Does that make sense? He wasn't supposed to just walk off and then go to somebody else and say, I'm working for you now. No, you got to go to court. You got to add, you got to get a lawyer. You got to do all these things to get up from under Anthony Johnson. You got to handle it the legal way. Now, let's go to John Punch real quick. Now, John Punch tried to run away. He got caught, and he was basically made an indentured servant for life. Now, I got an emotional person on YouTube. I'm going to read what they say. This argument is flawed because what you're explaining is still exploiting a people out of their ignorance. Later laws changed, so those people couldn't own land. People were bought here illegal. If there wasn't any slaves, why did England/Britain outlaw it? Now, this person's emotional, right? Now, did I ever say there wasn't slavery? Not one time. What I said was all of this was going on when slavery started in 1619. All this taking place in the 1600s, not the 1800s. This happening in the 1600s. Before lynching, before all of that, this was happening. So when we talk about slavery being a choice, you got to ask yourself a question. Why is everybody going to the court system? Why is everybody, if it's such a human rights issue, if it's such a humanitarian issue, then why is everybody going to the courts? Why didn't Johnson just snatch up Kaser and take him back? Why did he put chains around his neck and drag him back to the tobacco farm? Why didn't he beat him? Why didn't he shoot him? Why didn't he kill him? Why wasn't in these stories, why isn't anybody treated inhumanely? Why not? You all are too grown to be this emotional. When the truth is staring you right in your face. Why weren't these people mutilated? Why weren't they lynched? Why wasn't the dogs hunting them down? Why wasn't the white guys there with rifles and dogs hunting them down? Why is this stuff handled in the court? There's a reason why. Why is the court honoring this? There's a reason why. And I said Kaser should have taken his boss to court. You can't just breach the contract. Because once you breach the contract, you're in violation. So, for example, if your job is treating you wrong, you can't just abandon your job. If your job is treating you wrong, you can't just walk off the job. You got to handle it the right way. This applies today. If your job is treating you wrong, you got to go through the proper channels to hold your job in check. A lot of you all are so emotional, you all just walk off the job. And guess what they're going to do? Person fired for abandoning post, abandoning position, abandoning job. It's easy because y'all are emotional. Y'all are too grown to be this emotional. Someone said there's a process. Of course it's a process. It's always a process. I'm telling you all this stuff is going on in the 1600s. So that means you got white people and black people that were slaves. As I said earlier, I read it. I said white and black people had lifetime indentured servitude contracts, i.e. a slave. I said this earlier. But then a person gets on here and they're emotional because I'm snatching away their blackness. That's my goal, though. My goal is to erase blackness. That's my goal, is to snatch it away. That is my goal. To let you know that everything they told you about slavery was a bold-faced lie. Everything they told you about slavery was a bold-faced lie. John Punch was an enslaved African who lived in the colony of Virginia. Thought to have been an indentured servant, Punch attempted to escape to Maryland and was sentenced in July of 1640 by the Virginia Governor's Council to serve as a slave for the remainder of his life. 2 European men who ran away with him received a lighter sentence of extended indentured servitude. For this reason, some historians consider John Punch the first official slave in the English colonies. I'm going to say it again. For this reason, some historians consider John Punch the first official slave in the English colonies. But wait a minute. That was in 1640. They told us the first slaves arrived in 1619. Somebody's lying. If the first slave ship arrived in 1619, then how could he be considered the first slave in 1640? Okay. Now, I see some of you smart people on here talking. You know, you chiming in, you talking, you giving all this. But the thing is this, though. Why is this discussion not had on these large platforms? Why aren't the Democrats talking about it? Why aren't your woke activists talking about it? Why aren't the white liberals talking? Why is nobody talking about this subject? Because you see, it's very detailed. It's very interesting. Why is nobody going through picking this stuff apart? Why not? Did Joe Biden go through this? Does Joe Biden know who John Punch is? Or did he just get on TV and say, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black, and y'all line up and do it? Or did he just say that the jab is like reparations, y'all decided to get the jab? Which one is it? I know slavery is a choice because I saw you all choose the J and J. Y'all chose the Joe and y'all chose the jab. I saw y'all. So you can't tell me that slavery wasn't a choice because in a time period where you all are completely free to do whatever you want to do, y'all chose bondage. Y'all chose bondage. In a time period where you all were free to do whatever you all wanted to do, I watched you all choose slavery. So don't tell me that slavery wasn't a choice because y'all chose it with freedom. Y'all chose it with freedom. Y'all told me y'all bosses, y'all kings, y'all queens. Y'all told me y'all CEOs, big boss, balling, all this stuff y'all told me. And then chose slavery. So, and in his case, as the first legal sanctioning of a lifelong slavery in the Chesapeake, some historians also consider this to be one of the first legal distinctions between Europeans and Africans made in the colony, and a key milestone in the development of the institution of slavery in the United States. So we can agree that slavery started with a person having a debt to pay. Slavery started with a person having a debt to pay. That's what it started with. Not all this white man got to get you. No, no, no. You had a debt to pay and you ran away. So y'all getting mad and y'all do the same thing today. You're going to say, well, he did it too. If you broke the rules, you broke the rules. To whom much is given, that much more is required. So y'all can't brag to me about how great y'all are and how much better you are than white people are and then expect the same punishment. That don't make any sense. To whom much is given, that much more is required. So if you all are better than white people, then your punishment going to be harder. Makes sense to me. If I'm 10 years old and my little brother's 5 years old and we both get in trouble, who really going to get in trouble? Me, right? If I'm 10 years old and my brother is 5 years old and we both get in trouble, who's going to get in more trouble? Me, right? So you all are running around saying we are better than white people. If that's the case, then that means you have a more severe punishment because more is required of you. So you all thought that it was something like because you was black, they was holding you back. No, they just saw you in a higher light. So they expect more out of you. So that way, when you all go to court, instead of pleading out, fight the case. Have some faith to fight the case, but you can't fight the case because you know you're guilty. You can say the system is corrupt, the judge is crooked, the DA, the public pretender, all that stuff, you can say it. But at the end of the day, you ain't fighting that case because you know good and well that you're guilty. That's it, and that's all. Y'all get locked up because y'all want to avoid punishment. When a white person's going to court of a certain, and not even just white, when people of a higher economic status go to court, they're going to win the case. When y'all go to court on the lower end, y'all going to avoid punishment. Two different approaches, two different outcomes in the case. So in both of these cases, both of these men decided to take matters into their own hands and decided to leave without finishing their debt. And it cost them their what? Their life. In July of 2012, Ancestry.com published a paper suggesting that John Punch was 12th generation grandfather of President Barack Obama and is on his mother's side. Now, make this make sense to me. Barack Obama's mother is Jewish, right? But Barack Obama's mother is Jewish. So how is John Punch on his mother's side? Hear me out. John Punch, if they're saying, is an enslaved African. John Punch. Barack Obama's ancestry comes from John Punch on his mama's side, but his mama is Jewish. I don't know how that works. But it gives you an indication of what you all see with your own eyes. Don't talk about a person's bloodline. This is how you all get deceived, because they show you all a black face, big pun intended, terror squad. They show you all a black face, and you all assume that everybody's the same based on appearance, but not the bloodline. I told y'all before that bloodline and what somebody looks like are two different things. If you follow that bloodline, a lot of folks that look white come from y'all. I'm gonna say it again. If you follow that bloodline, a lot of folks that look like you all, that look white, come from you all. It come from you all. I'll let the video play a little bit on YouTube, y'all. So it's bloodline. And so in the Bible, that's why they tell you who begot who, because they knew at a certain time and point, folks gonna start looking different. So you got to be able to trace the bloodline back to the source. But y'all are so caught up in being black, you don't even realize that Barack's mama, her lineage comes from y'all. And she a white Jewish woman. How is it possible? Because bloodline ain't got nothing to do with appearance. Bloodline ain't got nothing to do with appearance. That's why I told you all at the very top, it could be y'all sitting up there causing all this havoc. No, Blanchard, it's white folks. It's white folks at the top doing it. It's white. Man, you don't know who at the top. You assume it's white people. You don't know who above them. You don't know if it's us sitting at the top. You don't even know, but you assume it's not because you have an inferiority complex. You have an inferiority complex. You believe there's no way we could be in a position that high. You believe there's no way we could be in a position that high, so you just assume there's only white people. I've been peeped, y'all. I'll tell y'all something. None of this stuff's gonna work because it doesn't deal with the character of the person. Now, would you all believe that they told you all that John Punch was a slave, right? That's what they said, right? So if John Punch was a slave, how did he have children with a white woman? I'm asking you again. If John Punch was a slave, how did he have children with a white woman? Thank you, P. Dot. Thank you for the badge. Thank you, P. Dot. Thanks for the badge, P. Dot. If John Punch was a slave, then how did he have children with a white woman? Can someone explain it to me? Okay. Genealogical research indicates that sometime in the 1630s, during slavery, Punch married a white woman. They told y'all slaves couldn't get married. In the 1630s, John Punch married a white woman. If he was a slave, how is it possible? By 1637, hold on, listen to me. Genealogical research indicates that sometime in the 1630s, Punch married a white woman, likely also an indentured servant. So that means he wasn't a slave. And she was also white and indentured servant. So that means they was working side by side. So that means during this time, you saw black and white on the plantation together, on the farms together. But the history only shows you one group on the history shows you white folks on the porch, black folks in the field. This shows you black or white on the porch, black and white in the field. You see how me talking about this takes away all of the leverage anybody has over blackness? If everybody was a slave, what are we crying about now? Oh, okay. Likely also an indentured servant. By 1637, he had fathered a son called John Bunch, labeled by genealogists as John Bunch the First. While researchers cannot definitively prove that Punch was the father of Bunch, he is the only known African man of that time and place who is a possible progenitor. Punch and his wife are known as the first black and white couple in the colonies who left traceable descendants. It remains possible that the father of Bunch was another African of whom there is no record, but the similarity of the names would still need to be explained. So we got a whole different picture of slavery with John Punch and Anthony Johnson, with an indentured servant versus slavery. And to think that Barack Obama is the descendant of the man they're calling the first slave. How ironic. How ironic for the first black president to be related to the first black slave. Isn't that a bit coincidental? Isn't that a bit coincidental that the first black slave, later his lineage would lead him to be the first black president? Sound like a movie, don't it? Like a good script, from slave to president. Ironically, his great forefather was married to a white woman during a time period where they tell you all are getting slaughtered. So this man is walking around married to a white woman with children and supposed to be a slave, and ain't nobody touching. So in the Jewish culture, the bloodline comes through the mother. The father has the seed, right? The father has the seed, but the egg has the blood. These practical terms. The father has the sperm, the woman has the egg, which is the blood. So the sperm has to fertilize the egg. This is why they say the bloodline comes through the mother. Women have a menstrual cycle once a month. Women have a menstrual cycle. This is why they say the bloodline comes through the mother. The father carries the seed, but the seed has to be planted, and it's planted into the woman's womb, therefore to produce a child. So John Punch is on Barack Obama's mother's side. I need y'all to pay attention. Not his father's side, on his mother's side. Nobody believes that Barack Obama's father is from Kenya. I don't. I don't believe it. But somebody said, dude, not black. Thank you, Money Todd. Thank you so much. I'm gonna pin that. No, Barack Obama is not what you consider black. He's not. But I want you all to just get your minds to wrap around. It's not about what somebody looks like. Barack Obama's mother is a white Jewish woman, and her forefathers were John Punch, the guy considered to be the first slave. You understand what I'm saying? Now, I'm a exit out of Instagram real quick, and I'm gonna come right back because I want to get on these slave ships real quick and just talk about the slave ships. I'm gonna get out because I know my time is coming to an end. Or maybe it's not. I think it's coming to an end pretty soon. But somebody said he's Hawaiian. But we're about to go into these slave ships, and we're going to talk about the slave ships, and we're going to talk about how they can't find any slave ships. They can't find them. So I'm going to exit out of Instagram right now, and then I'm going to come right back. Y'all hold on, YouTube. YouTube, hold on. Okay. Sorry about that, y'all. Sorry about that, y'all. I'm gonna tell you this right now. None of these movements are gonna work. I don't care if it's Hebrew Israelites. I don't care if it's the Moors. I don't care if it's the Nation of Islam. I don't care if it's the Black Panthers. I don't care if it's any. None of these groups are ever going to work, and they're never going to work because they don't address character. They don't. They get information, but they don't address character, and the character is really what defines a man. A man's character is his faith. So a person's character is what defines who the person is. All these groups out here are making it about what they know and how they can leverage what they know for a better position in society. But in actuality, if Babylon is going to fall, what is it going to matter in the big scheme of things? It's not going to matter. It just won't matter. So I'm going to just shatter these notions right now about these slave ships. Let me now. And I'll probably address Harriet Tubman next time. Okay. So the slave ships were they say the slave ships were cargo ships converted into slave ships. The slave ships were cargo ships converted into slave ships. Right? So that means that these ships were designed with the hull of the ship big to carry a lot of cargo. So the whole slavery narrative comes from the Blatrix. You got the Matrix, you got the Gatrix, you got the Blatrix. These are systems of control. And what you all will find, again, I'll say this, is that any identity that is attached to this world comes with its own system of control. So even if the person says, I'm a patriot, there's still a system of control attached to it. Even if someone says, I'm a Christian, there's still a system of control attached to it. So whatever you identify with this world, there will always be a system of control that attaches to it. In other words, they can use that identity, whatever you choose, against you. This is why our identity needs to come from God. It means we're not defined by religious practice, religious belief, skin color, nationality, race, orientation. None of those things are supposed to classify us as people. We are God's children. So at the end of the day, that's our identity. Anything else leads down a hole, and ultimately you go into the mark of the beast. So the first slave ship arrived in 1619. The first slave ship arrived in 1619. Now, many people say it was called Jesus, but the ship was actually called, it was translated into White Lion. So the ship was called White Lion. It wasn't called Jesus, you know. In late August 1619, 20 to 30 enslaved Africans landed at Point Comfort, today's Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, aboard the English private ship White Lion. Let me ask you all a question. How much money would you really make off of 20 to 30 slaves? Think about it. How much money would you really make off of 20 to 30 slaves? The first slave ship had 20 or 30 people on it. How much money are you going to make off of that? It would take 20 or 30 slaves to tend to half of one farm. So did one person order 20 or 30 slaves? Why is the number so low for the first slave ship? If you're talking about, think about it, we're talking about a transatlantic slave trade, which means you have to have buyers for these slaves. There has to be a market for slavery. So you mean to tell me we're going to look into this, you would do all of this work to get cargo ships, to get budgets, to do all this stuff, to go get some slaves, and you only bring in 20 or 30? Does that make sense? Does that make good business sense? The slave ships average 30 people on the crew. Does it make good business sense to do all this stuff to just bring 20 or 30 slaves? It doesn't really make any sense. It don't make any sense. And the first slave ship was not called Jesus. So y'all can stop repeating that. So the first slave ship arrived in 1619. So I'm going to ask you all a question. When did the second slave ship arrive? When did the second slave ship arrive? Because if there's a slave trade, there must have been a high demand for slaves, right? So my question is, when did the second slave ship arrive to Virginia or any other state? Okay. Now, what you're going to find interesting is this. When it comes to America, right? When it comes to America, they documented when the first slave ship landed and when the last slave ship landed, but everything in between is kind of murky. It's murky waters. You would think a slave ship being documented would be something that happens all the time. Like it would be like clockwork. Orders come in, you dock the ship, who's the captain, who's the crew, but for some reason, it wasn't done. It was done with the first one, it was done with the last one, but everything else in between was kind of murky. Everything else in between was kind of murky. Now you got to ask yourself, we're going to go through these numbers too. So now when I was younger, they used to tell us that there were 100 million slaves in the transatlantic slave trade. 100 million. As time went on, we found out it was a lie. There's a stat archive right here, and this website is called Statista, and I like them because they actually just give you the raw numbers. Most of the other places got all kind of narratives. They beat your head in with racism and all this stuff. Then they give you the stats. Your mind already in a frenzy. We see they had 7,600 slaves went to Europe. 307,000 slaves went to North America. 765 slaves went to Cuba. 935,000 slaves went to Jamaica. 2,760,000 slaves went to the Caribbean. 356 slaves went to 356,000 slaves went to the Guyanas. 3,169,000 slaves went to Brazil, and 92,000 went to Argentina and Uruguay. So most of the slaves did not go to Europe or the United States. Did not go. So you got to ask yourself, how is the population of us in America so high if most of the slaves didn't come here to North America? Somebody said you like whitewashed info. I don't know don't know what that means. Now I know that most of the slavery narrative though deals with you already conditioned to be upset at white people, to feel inferior, to feel oppressed, to think you were slaves. So before we even get the actual information, we're already programmed and conditioned to have an inferior type of mindset. Okay, so the last slave, so listen to me. The first slave ship had 20 or 30 slaves on it, and the last slave ship had 110 slaves on it. Think about that. The first slave ship, let's say it had 30 slaves, and the last slave ship had 110. So we can see that the numbers of slaves being transported isn't really that high. Because it seems like to me, there would be more of a demand for slaves with everything that was being done in the country. Now, this is what's very interesting. From 1807 to 1860, British vessels captured 1,600 slaves. Hear me out. From 1807 to 1860, British vessels captured 1,600 slaves, right? And freed, pay attention, and freed 160,000 slaves. This is what the British vessels did from 1807 to 1860. Now I'm gonna ask you a question. In 53 years, there were only 1,600 slaves transported on British ships. Who's good at math? In 53 years, you got 1,600 slaves being transported on British vessels. Who wants to do the math for me? I did the math. Who wants to do the math? Who wants to do the math on 1,600 slaves in 53 years? Anybody want to do it? Okay, I'll do it. 1,600 slaves from 1807 to 1860 literally averages out to 30 slaves per year. That same 30 number that we saw with the first slave ship in 1619. I'm asking you all a question. How much money can a person make if they're only selling 30 slaves? From 1807 to 1860, the British vessels, they only bought over 1,600 slaves. That's 30 slaves per year. Ain't nobody making money off of 30 slaves per year. So what was they doing? They got slavery going on right now in the world, in Africa, in China, in the Middle East, and in America with the sex trafficking and all that stuff too. And they're moving more than 30 people a year. They're moving more than 30 people a year. They're moving more than 30 people a year. Antelope, a Spanish slave ship captured near Florida in 1820 with 283 slaves aboard, leading to the Antelope case. Now I'm going to ask you all a question. If slavery didn't end till 1863, then why would they need to capture a slave ship in 1820? Can somebody look up the exact year that slavery ended? I think it was 1863. Now, listen, hold on, now listen. Now, they on here calling me a coon. Now, why do you think they will be calling me a coon on this social media? If I'm giving you all history, why would they be calling me a coon? I'll tell you why. Because they want to be black. Part of being black is the comfort that you know that if push comes to shove, white people are going to take care of me. Black folks kick and scream all day, but deep down inside, they know white folks got me. How do we know this? Because they went out in droves and they got the J&J. They voted for Joe Biden. They voted for Joe and they got the jab. So that's how you know that the majority of our people actually really trust white people in the government. They do. You see it. It's plain. So the reason why I'm a coon is because I'm taking the shackles off. I'm saying to be black is to be controlled. Now, because they're so juvenile and their mind is so conditioned and manipulated, they think because I say I'm not black that I automatically want to be white. But that was the purpose of black and white, to give you a choice of two. If you can't be white and you're automatically stuck being black, it's called mental slavery. Democrat or Republican, they give you two choices. And then they tell you Republicans are racist. So you only got one choice. It's all by design. It's all by control. I say, don't be black. Be free. Because if you are black, you can almost guarantee that there is somebody controlling what black is. If you look on TV, you don't control anything about being black. Not in education, not in media, not in entertainment, not in sports. Black people don't control anything that comes to being black. Nothing. So why would you want to be a part of something that you have no control over? I'll tell you, because you're brainwashed, you're conditioned. I'll tell you, the same way these men in the beginning were indentured servants, and we saw Kaser literally went from being an indentured servant from this person to going to be an indentured servant to somebody else. He wasn't forced. He chose. So the same way I'm a coon is the same way these people are going to walk down to those internment camps in those green zones or those FEMA camps, because they're going to get on TV and they're going to say, black people, please go to the camps. Please save yourself. And they're going to march themselves right down to the camp. That's why I'm a coon, because I dare tell people the truth. So if slavery ended in 1863, why would a slave ship need to be captured in 1820? Again, people, they lied about the whole thing. Remember when Morpheus was talking to Neo? Remember when Morpheus was talking to Neo? And he told Neo, they did all of this to reduce you to this. They did all of that to reduce you to this. If we fast forward, what are these wicked and evil entities feeding off of? Your energy. You all expend large amounts of energy to be black. Being black is exhausting. It's tiring. It's restrictive. There's nothing good about it. There's nothing good about being black if it don't involve eating and dancing, shucking and jiving, partying. Other than that, ain't nothing good about being black. It's only good to be black when you partying, and then that's even has a time limit, because that's finna get shot up. That's finna get shot up. So Morpheus told you all, he told Neo that they reduced us to this. Now, in the Matrix story, the machines tried to work out a deal with humanity. Humanity said no. The machine said, let's make a deal. Humanity said no. No. So the end result was humanity tried to kill the machines. They tried to block the sun out. Yeah. So again, You all are going to fight to the death. You all are going to fight to the death. Let me go ahead and block this guy right here because you can't even be on here. Because this too much. It's too much. Let me give me a moderator. Who wants to be a moderator so I can let y'all do it? Who wants to be a moderator? Who wants to be a moderator on IG so I can get y'all to just cut these people's head off? So I can get y'all to just cut their head off. You be moderator, Brandon? I need somebody that's gonna swing a sword. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So it lets you know that the fight is not it's not person to person. It's not person to person. Oh yeah, let me go. Here you go, Bree. Yeah, I know Bree. Let me get Bree to do it. I know who to do it. Okay, Bree. Anybody on here sounding like they got the jab, the J&J. If they even sound like they voted for Joe Biden or they got the jab, go ahead and just block them. Ephesians 6:12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Now, so here we go. So, and I'm gonna tell y'all this too right now. I'll tell y'all this too. The people that call me coons, just give y'all a tidbit. People that call me coons, I guarantee they got the jab and they're liberals. They're liberal. Only liberals talk like that. Only liberals do it. I don't call people coons. It don't even cross my mind. It don't cross my mind. Most of these people think that Uncle Tom was a bad figure. Most of these folks think Uncle Tom was a sellout. They don't know anything. That's right, they zombies. But anyway, we're gonna get to it though. So the last slave ship that landed in Mobile, Alabama in 1860, eventually that community was formed into Africa Town. Now, what you all gotta understand is that America has never been 100% for slavery, nor has all the states endorsed slavery. America has never been 100% pro-slavery. Never. 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 From 1698 to 1807, 11,000 ships that were made in England transported 3 million Africans. So from 1698 to 1807, 11,000 ships were made in England to transport 3 million Africans. Now, ask yourself a question. If they made 11,000 ships, why do they only have 5 slave ships on the maritime log? If they made 11,000 slave ships, why are there only 5 ships on the maritime log? This is no different than the news put on there. How many people died from the Peter pandemic, but not how many people recovered? It's the same kind of manipulation. You have all these slave ships, but you don't have them on record. So if you only have 5 on record, how are we to believe that you had 11,000? It doesn't make any sense. And that's just England. Okay, let's keep going. So they said that these slave ships were traveling with shore boats, supplying the slavers, and Navy vessels protecting them. So wait a minute. You mean to tell me you got all these ships, all this manpower, all these resources to transport 250 to 600 slaves at a time. Is that even economically feasible? Is that even economically feasible to do all of this to transport 250 to 600 slaves? And from 1807 to 1860, they only transported 30 slaves per year. Why go through all of this? Why are we going through all of this when you can just get some folks in the area to work for you? Because most slavery is done in the area that people are at. Oh, let me get back to it. Let me get back to it. Aurora, hold on. Beezenstein, a Dutch West Indian Company slaver from 1722 to 1736. It's a Dutch West Indian Company, a slaver from 1722 to 1736. Why you get out the business? You got Brooks selling in the 1780s. You got Clotilda burned and sunk at Mobile in 1859 or 1860. You got Corora captured by the USS Constellation in 1860. Why were they capturing slave ships before slavery ended? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Why were they capturing slave ships before slavery ended? Let's get to it. Now, all the historians write, everyone agrees that the slave ships had a high mortality rate. All historians agree that the slave ships had a high mortality rate. Now, if the mortality rate was high, then how would you make a profit off of, let's say, 600 slaves? That would mean, let's say, half of the slaves would die. That means you got 600 slaves you would pay for, but you would only get 300 to the mainland, America. Out of those 300, how many would be sick? Think about it now. Listen, y'all. Take off your black costume, take off your white costume, and listen to what I am saying. If there was a high mortality rate on the slave ship, then that means most of the slaves would be sick. It's not high mortality rate, half die, half healthy. It's not how that works. It's just that the ones that don't die were healthier than the ones that died. So if 600 slaves on the slave ship and 300 die, we can venture to say that out of the 300 that are left, 200 are sick. So we can say that most slaves on the slave ship were sick based on their conditions. Okay. Based on the conditions. And I'm asking you all to just think about business. They're saying it was capitalism, it was racism, it was colonialism, it was all these things. But we still got to realize that it was there to make a profit, because these slaves were actually used as labor to build or create something or cultivate something that was going to generate a profit. So these slaves were really here to work. That was the function of a slave, was labor. So the high mortality rates on the slave ships, we got disease, we got mistreatment, we got accidents, and we got suicides. So these slaves are pretty much dying from disease, mistreatment, accidents, and suicides. Now, they want you to believe that there were 6 million total Africans that came from Africa, 6 million. over 54,000 voyages, but they only have 5 slave ships on record. 54,000 voyages, but they only have 5 slave ships on record. Does that even make sense? That's almost like having something that has a 99.8% recovery rate and then you mandating a snake bite for it. It's just as ridiculous as that. It has a 99% recovery rate and you're mandating a snake bite for it. You got 54,000 voyages, but only 5 ships on record. It's not making sense. Can someone help me out? Why is it not making sense, y'all? Let's go so I can read you all. I got a whole bunch of articles. I want to read you all. It might be easier to just find it on here because I can't. Might be. Give me 1 second. Give me 1 second. So they've been looking for these so-called slave ships, right, for years. They've been looking for these so-called slave ships for years, and they haven't been able to find them, but they're telling you they had so many. I mean, they found Viking ships. They found ancient medieval ships. They found ships. They even found Noah's Ark, supposedly. But they can't find any slave ships. So it's not really making sense to me why they can't find any slave ships. Why they can't find any slave ships. I did a video that went viral about 2 years ago where I was asking the question sarcastically. I was like, where are the slave ships? You know, and I was asking because I didn't know they didn't have any slaves. Like I just assumed they had slave ships. I just assumed it. I assumed they had slave ships. I just assumed. I'm like, you know, they got to be. But if you think about it, if they really had slave ships, I believe that the slave ship, they recorded ships because you had to. Listen, let's say this. Shipping logs have been in existence for years. You always log in who comes in, who leaves, who's the captain, what they brought. Like this is done all the time. So why is it such a murky area when it comes to slave ships? They do this all the time. This is nothing new. Maritime law and all that is not. They always track what's coming in and what's leaving the port. So why is it when it's coming to slave ships, they only got 5 on record? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Why would you change the process up for all these 54,000 voyages? 54,000 voyages means 54,000 times a ship went to a port and you only got 5. It don't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. You know, I get called coon and all this stuff, but it still don't make any sense. I can be a coon and all that. It still don't make any sense, though. It still don't make any sense. It still don't make any sense. So if we had, it took anywhere from 35 days to 3 months for the slave transport. Now, I want you all to put your thinking caps back on. The slaves were dying from disease, mistreatment, accident, suicide, even the crew mortality, meaning the people that was on the crew, 30 members, 20% of them were dying. Now listen now. This is what they said. They said the crew members had to sleep on top of the open deck with no shelter. They was getting malaria, they were getting yellow fever, and they were getting beat too. And they were getting cheated out of their earnings often. So let me ask you a question. Why would somebody go to work? Just use your mind. Why would someone go to work where I could possibly die, not get paid, and get beat? Why would someone go to work? Why would someone go to work where I could possibly die, get beat, and not get paid? This is what they said about the crews on slave ships. So you had 54,000 voyages. That means that crews and people were lining up by the thousands to go on a voyage where you might die from malaria, yellow fever, get beat, no shelter, no. Who would do it? Who would do it? All the historians agree it was very hard for the crew of slave ships. Now, in the movies, they show you all the slave ships. They got blonde hair, blue eyes, six packs, chiseled, whooping slaves. Just no. They had to sleep on top of the deck with no shelter. Yellow fever, malaria, and they was getting beat, and they often got cheated out of their earnings. Who would sign up to be a crew member on a slave ship when I could be a crew member on a regular ship where I got food and shelter, didn't get beat, and I got paid? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And there were African sailors, African slave ship sailors who worked for Great Britain. So now you got the image of, they said it was Africans on ships transporting slaves, and it was white folks getting beaten. So imagine on this ship over here, it's some white folks getting beaten and not paid. And then on this ship over here, it's some Africans getting paid for transporting Africans. I'm just telling y'all what the historians say, not me. This ain't me. It doesn't make any sense. The trip lasts anywhere from 35 days to 3 months. Anywhere from 35 days to 3 months. Let me ask you all a question. Where was the food stored? Where was the food stored? Where was the food stored for 250 to 600 slaves and 30 crew members? That's anywhere from 280 people to 630 people on the ship. Where is the food, and where was the food stored? This is in the 1600s. So how do they keep food on the slave ships without the food spoiling? Somebody said they didn't eat. So they fasted the whole way to America, right? How long can a person last in those conditions? Can someone look this up for me? How long can a person last without eating? How long can a person last without eating? Now, I know without water is 10 days. So this says a person can live without food 8 to 21. Somebody said 40 days. Someone said 40 days. How many days? 8 to 21 days. Okay, so basically, so you can only last 40 days with water. So my question is, where do they get the water from? You on a slave ship for 35 days to 3 months. Where do they get the water from? You can't drink salt water because it's going to end up killing you. So where do they get the water from? There's a process called desalination. Desalination is what makes the salt water less salty. And that requires you to boil the water and then you collect the steam. How do you boil water and collect steam for 280 people to 630 people? Where was the water and where was the food? Where was the water and where was the food? You can't drink ocean water and you can't fish enough. It's too much work. It's not feasible. Where was the food and where was the water? Okay, listen, because I see y'all think y'all smart. The human being, the human body, can last 10 days without water, 40 days with water and no food. So even if a person survived the trip, who is going to pay for a slave that's near death? Who's going to pay for a slave that weighs 80 pounds and can barely stand up? When they show you the auction block, they show you these big old bucks, 6'4", 250, big, strong, big bucks. A person on these slave ships couldn't get enough calories to be a buck. You couldn't get enough calories to be a buck. It doesn't make sense. Who's going to pay for a slave getting off a ship that's near death? First of all, if you even survived the trip, they have to drag you off the ship because you couldn't stand up and walk. Who would pay for the slaves? Who would pay for them? Where was the food stored? No refrigerator, no freezer. Where was the food stored? Where was the water stored? Everything about these slave ships, everything about them is unrealistic. You mean to tell me a person would invest all of this money for a product that would be dwindled down and diminished by the time it got to its destination? It doesn't make any sense. There's no way a person is paying for a malnourished slave. They're not going to do it. It's not going to happen. So they're telling you all that the slaves endured these harsh conditions, but nobody's talking about the realistic accounts of what they're talking about. Let's see. I'm 6'2", let's say 205, right? I'm 6'2", 205. Maybe like 208, right? And I gotta eat what I want to eat to maintain this size. So to be 205, I gotta eat what I want to eat to just maintain my weight. Imagine 2 months of you barely eating and barely getting water and fighting off disease. It's not realistic. It's not realistic. What was that boat on Peter Pan that was in the air? That's your slave ship. What was that boat? What was that boat called in Peter Pan? What was that ship called with Captain Hook? That's your slave ship. Because a ship got a better chance of flying than it does to transport some slaves back then for a trip that took 35 days to 3 months. So you got to ask yourself, why has nobody asked these questions? Why has no one asked these questions? Something simple as, how did slaves drink water? That's what it was called, the Jolly Roger. That's what the slave ship is. It's the Jolly Roger from Peter Pan. The Peter Pandemic, now these slave ships are the Jolly Roger. The same thing. So you mean to tell me, this is what we're saying, that the slave trade, the crew members might not get paid, 20% of them gonna die, and they got beat. And they had to sleep on top of the deck uncovered. Who would sign up for the job? When it goes to the slaves, how did they feed the slaves? How did they give them water? And this is all done with a high mortality rate. So that means they're on the ship and everybody's dying. Who would want to go on the ship? Who would want to go on the ship? Somebody said apparently 1 in 5 slaves died. Actually, it was more than 1 in 5. Actually, it was more than that. It was a high mortality rate. Higher than 1 out of 5. But what we got to say is that the likelihood of this taking place, how they say it took place, didn't happen. Other accounts say there were 92,000 intra-American slave voyages, but they only got 5 slave ships on record. There were 10.5 million slaves that went to the Americas. The numbers are, and it's another thing, the numbers are all over the place. They got 10 million, 10.5 million. They got 4.5 to the Caribbean, 3.2 to Brazil, 450. Like the numbers are all over the place. Even they say that 60,000 to 70,000 came from the Caribbean to the U.S. as slaves. They say 12 million slaves were brought to the New World. All this stuff, right? All this stuff. And nobody's even asking the question of how the slaves made the voyage. We're talking about 12,000 slave ships, 54,000 voyages, 250 years, and they only got 5 ships on the maritime history database. They only got 5 ships out of 12,000 ships, 40,000 to 54,000 voyages, 250 years, and they only got 5 ships on the maritime database. Does that make sense, y'all? Does that make sense? Creole, involved in the United States coastwide slave trade and the scene of a slave rebellion in 1841, leading to the Creole case. You know what's funny about all these cases? A lot of these cases, there were slave revolts on ships, and then they went to court. You all told me we were 3/5 of a human being. You all told me we were treated so inhumanely, but every time we bucked, we ended up going to court. So the trend I see is anytime you buck, they went to court. Amistad, the movie Amistad, right? Slave revolt, they went to court and got free. So wait a minute. Y'all told me that slavery was hanging, beating, slave catchers, rapes, butt breaking, all this, but we saw the movie Amistad like it didn't happen. Oh, in Amistad, slave revolt on a ship, came to America, went to court, won, and went back home. All during slavery. How is it that y'all told me that the slaves didn't have any rights? 3/5 of a human beings, all this stuff, but yet when they went to court, they was winning or losing, but they was going to court. Why would the courts even entertain a person that wasn't even a human being? It doesn't make any sense. You know why it doesn't? Because it wasn't true. I got case after case. They got all these slave ships landing, but they ain't got no dates. All these slave ships, they said, listen, Erie, the ship owned and captained by Nathaniel Gordon, the only American executed for slave trading. How was he executed for slave trading if he was just trading? How was Nathaniel Gordon executed for slave trading if America was built on slavery? How was Nathaniel Gordon executed for slave trading if America was built on slavery? Do y'all hear what I'm telling you all? Let's find some more. Guerrero, Spanish slave ship, wrecked in the Florida Keys in 1827, carrying 561 Africans. So you mean to tell me the people sailed from Spain to Africa, then to Florida, and then the ship sank, 1827? And I'm going to ask y'all again, how did they feed the slaves on the ship? How did they give them water? And who in the world is going to pay for a near-death slave to do back-breaking labor? They told us the slaves were working 25 hours out of every day. They was working 8 days a week and 25 hours out of every day. So how in the world would someone pay for a slave that couldn't even stand up on his own? How? It doesn't make good business sense. Hope, American brig that brought slaves to Rhode Island, no date. You notice the trend. All these ships that are coming to America with these slaves, no dates. Anytime a ship comes into port, it's logged. Anytime a ship leaves the port, it's logged. So why are they abandoning that entire process for the slave ships? Why are they abandoning the entire logging ship process for slave ships? All these voyages, 54,000 voyages, but you only got 5 on record. Does that make sense to you all? 99%, 99.8% recovery rate, but you're mandating a snake bite. Does it make sense? It doesn't. All of this is the Matrix. Somebody said the Mayflower got a date. Exactly. Somebody said, where did they use the bathroom? Where did the slaves use the bathroom? How much feces? Well, I guess they wasn't using the bathroom because they wasn't eating. according to this, they wasn't eating. So they wasn't going to the bathroom. Josefa, a Spanish schooner, carrying 206 slaves, when captured by the HMS Monkey, April 7, 1829. Why are they capturing slave ships during the slave trade? Why are slave ships being captured before slavery is ending? It doesn't make any sense. Do y'all understand that this doesn't make any sense? Someone said, how did they escape muscular dystrophy? Think about being on a slave ship, cramped up, no movement of your joints or your muscles. Like, Manuelita, Spanish slave ship carrying 485 Africans, when captured by the HMS Nimble on December 7th, 1833. Why are they capturing all these slave ships before slavery is ended? It doesn't make any sense, people. So you mean to tell me they got ships patrolling the Atlantic Ocean to find who's transporting slaves? Was this the first Coast Guard? Like, what are we talking about? Do you know how much manpower is being used to transport this small amount of people across the world? It doesn't make any. Look at all the manpower, all the resources being used to transport this small amount of people across the world. And you hope the people on the ship make it to. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Even if we separate indentured servants from slavery, they still got to make it over here. They still have to make it over to this country. You can't live but 10 days without water. You can only live 40 days without food, but still have water. They didn't have either one. So how are they making it between 35 days and 3 months to come on? And who would pay for a malnourished slave off a slave? They're not going to do it. It's just not real. It's not true. It can't be. It can't be. The crew members alone, who would work a job where y'all going to beat me, not pay me, and I got to sleep on top of the deck with no shelter? Who would do it? Listen, I love you all, and I thank y'all for tuning in. I'm going to finish this up with Harriet Tubman and the feasibility and likelihood of Harriet Tubman. But I want to thank you all for tuning in. Somebody said, wasn't there black slave owners? Exactly, there was. But I love you all, and I thank you all so much. And y'all have a great and wonderful day. Thank you all on YouTube. I love you all too. Thank you.